Okay. Yeah, so hi, if you're watching from home, if you have any questions, you can just type in and I'll get to them as I go. But this is UNF's workshop on integrating source materials. And if you're watching at home, you can just look at the PowerPoint as I go along. It's a very short PowerPoint. So yeah, we'll start going through it. Maybe if it'll, hold on, PowerPoint's not working. Okay, so this is just sort of an overview of the workshop. It's just really trying to look at the differences between the different types of sources. So the main ones that you're going to be having in papers, it's going to be primary and secondary sources. So I'm sure you've heard the professors say, oh, you need so many amount of primary sources or X amount of secondary sources. And so a primary source, the best way to put it is sort of like an original document about something. So you can think of it like a historical document, like some or historical artifact sort of thing. And like if you're working in like the humanities, like a primary source could be like a novel, a play, anything like that was created by someone and now you're reading it. And now secondary sources, they're sources that are where people interpret a primary source. So a good example of this would be like, let's say your professor had you read, I don't know, Moby Dick or something. And he's like, okay, you need to find a secondary source about Moby Dick. A secondary source would be someone interpreting it. So it'd be like an academic article on it, someone who's written an analysis about it. So really a secondary source just sort of is written about a primary source. And then other than sort of knowing that difference, when you're trying to find sources for whatever type of paper you're working with, you have to be able to find the best sources. And typically professors will point you to like the UNF database. That's a really good way to find sources. And really just going to the library and doing it sort of the old-fashioned way, just looking at books, because even though we have a lot of online materials, often still the best sources are still in print, despite all of this online information. And so as you're writing final papers, when you're looking at different secondary sources, you have to decide, what their use value is. So, I mean, if you're writing a paper on like I'm just thinking of really stupid, like a psychoanalysis of Moby Dick or something. You obviously wouldn't want to find a bunch of sources doing different types of readings of it. So when you're looking at these different secondary sources, you have to decide, okay, what's going to be the most useful for me to integrate. And so that's really the challenge here. And we'll get into this a bit more when we're looking at an example. But this idea of the sandwich method is a really good way to integrate quotes, because the most often or the most frequent way you're going to be interacting with your sources, you're going to be quoting from them. You're going to be using, like block quotes or stuff like that. And a really useful way to do them, it's called the sandwich method. And the way you do it, it's like you introduce your quoted material by like saying something like, as Herman or as whoever argues, then comma, and then your quoted material, and then after your quoted material, that's where you put your analysis. Because the one of the main pitfalls when students integrate quoted material, often they'll just quote and they won't really explain the quotes. They'll just sort of quote and then move on to the next thing. So sort of a rule of thumb is however much you quote, you want to double the analysis. So because it really needs to be clear when you're integrating source material, why it's significant to your argument. So like, let's say you quote something, you're writing any type of paper. After the quote, you would say something like, and this point reinforces, whatever. So really, you just have to make sure that you have all these pieces when you're integrating these different sources. And then your citation, are you working in like MLA or APA? MLA. Okay, MLA. Yeah, so with citations, in-text citations, really the best way to do that is often if you're using online databases like at the UNF library. They'll have like the citation already done for you, I think, which is really helpful. Yeah, I mean, it's sort of like a cheat way to do it. I mean, whatever, work smarter, not harder, right? But for in-text citations, always double check those with MLA or APA, because sometimes you can Hey, Ryan. Come to the door.
Hey, Carl.
You're on.
I know.
But you really need to double check your in-text citations because like I see a lot of students when they're working in MLA, sometimes they'll sort of mix it up to where they're using AP also, what they'll have like, the author's last name and then the date in MLA. And so always double check your in-text citations. And it's really easy to just go online and you just Google like, MLA in-text citation. Because sometimes, especially if you're working with online sources, sometimes if you're like missing information like, an author or something, or you don't have a title, there's different ways to do that. And if you want, I can provide you with some resources to check some of your citations. And then when you're working in your works cited, once again, there's plenty of resources that I can provide you with to go over that. So this is just sort of, and we're just going to go through this together. This is just someone's writing a paper. I think it's about supernatural. I'm not really familiar with the show, but here it is. So I'm just going to read this paragraph, and then as we go, we'll just see if you think that they're employing this sort of idea of the sandwich method, where they set it up and then they do the integrated material. So here's the paragraph. So these gaps condition the audience to understand the rules of hunting and emotional history of the Winchester brothers through a structure of gossip rather than explication. So the show employs gossip in the way that Baumeister et al. Observe when they write. Indeed, one might say that gossip goes beyond educating the hearer about social norms, it affirms them. The hearer in this case is the viewer. The story of the Winchesters is in part a rumored story which makes a certain kind of sense. For example, the fourth-season meta-episode Monster at the end of this book signals the structure when Cassio reveals that Chuck is writing the Gospel of the Winchesters. A gospel is gossip. Gossip is fragmented and authored somewhat anonymously, masking the source of information so that one is always chasing the initial telling, the first event. So even internally, the show reinforces the viewer's perspective as part hunter, part gatherer. So the way do you see any problems with the way they've sort of integrated this information? Because they've got, they sort of set up their quote a bit where they've got at the beginning of the sentence, and this sort of, Danielle has a question in this. Yeah, so this is a good question that Danielle is asking. So with the sandwich method, about using a quote at the beginning of a sentence. So yeah, you never want to start a sentence with a quote just standing by itself. So as part of the sandwich method is that you need to always set it up with some type of intro thing. So you would never have just sort of a sentence that starts with a quote, unless, I mean, and maybe one example I could see if maybe you started like a sentence with like maybe a short phrase or something, like quoted material and then comma, as such and such argues. So so actually maybe I take that back a little bit. You can start with a quote, but you have to make sure that after the quote, it's sort of reverse sandwich method then, where you have a bit of a quoted material and then you have a comma or whatever as such and such argues. Does that make sense, Danielle? I mean, it's sort of, you just have to make sure that you never have a quote standing alone by itself. It always needs to be introduced again. So when you're introducing a quote, all you have to do is you just need to make sure that it needs to be something like, this author argues. So like if your author's last name, I'll just use your last name, Alan. If you're, as Alan argues in her article X, comma, and then you have your quote, and then after your quote, that's when you have your analysis. So the point of the sandwich method really is just that you're never just putting a quote in and leaving it. And introducing your quote, you don't have to do it that way. You can also use a colon. But when you use a colon, it's a very specific way to do it. It always there has to be a complete sentence before the colon if you're going to use that to introduce a quote. So for instance, it would be Thoreau ends the novel with a metaphor, and then colon, and then the quotes. So it's okay to use a colon to introduce quoted material, but you have to make sure that the material, before the colon is a complete sentence. Normally, but you would just use a comma though if you're using quoted material. But typically you can use a colon maybe if you want to add emphasis though. But it just has to be a complete sentence. But I can, there's a really good resource for the sandwich method. I forgot what college it was, but they sort of like showed you the different parts of it. But we can go more into the sandwich method with this example. So do you guys think with this example that they employed the sandwich method effectively, or do you see any problems with it?
Not that effective.
Yeah, so it sort of seems like, and for one thing, they have this really long setup, and that's another thing you have to consider. You have to consider sort of the length of your setup. Here, it's this very long sentence, and then we get to the quote, and so you have to sort of consider the ways in which it's the clearest way to integrate them. So if I would suggest to this author, maybe instead of having this really long setup, trying to work on their concision a bit here. And so really because it's really part of the sandwich method also is making sure that your quoted material is integrated clearly. Do you see any problems with maybe the way so after the quote, when you get to the analysis, do you see, and if you're watching from home, I'm just looking at the paragraph where it says workshop summary. Do you see any problems with their analysis? Do you think it's like vague in relationship to the quote?
Yeah, pretty much. They don't really analyze it that much more after the quote.
Yeah, yeah.
The context is before.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. I mean, you have sort of the context a little bit. They have the quote. And then it seems like we don't really understand the relationship of the quote to the argument, and so it's really just not clear how all the different pieces go together. So if you were sort of advising someone what to do here, what would you tell them?
I would break up the really long sentence and put the quote in.
Mm-hmm.
Another sentence, and then add more analysis to that before transitioning to the, I guess, rest of the paragraph there.
Yeah, and that's really good advice, because I mean it's just making sure that you have balance, that you have enough analysis. So yeah, I think that's really good advice to give to an author. Let's see, got a question. Megan, can you clarify your question a bit? So leave the reader asking why. Do you mean not adding extra information or trying to set up the argument more? I just maybe if you can try to clarify your question a bit. But while you're doing that, I'm going to move on a bit. Okay, and so if you brought anything, did you guys bring a writing sample with you, or do you have any essays that you brought? Because we're going to do some guided practice. Just to make sure that we can employ this sandwich method idea. And so this is really sort of the process in which you integrate quotes. So you obviously select your quote, and then you integrate it, and then you cite it. So that's just, I mean, all that is just the steps to it. Okay, so we're moving pretty fast through this because it's really not integrating sources. I mean, it's not. Yes, the sandwich method, it's, any type of writing you're doing, anytime when you, Joseph online asked a question, it's, anytime you're using the sandwich method, you can use this applies to all types of writing. This is science writing, this is, any type of analytical writing, I think. Anytime you're using an argument, where you're integrating someone else's material, this type of method where you're introducing the quote. Yes, but yeah, Megan, you just need to make sure when you're using the sandwich method to set it up, as long as what you're doing is clear and it's related to your argument and you've integrated your quotes in a way that doesn't confuse the reader, I think that's fine. So as long as it's set up in a way that's not unclear, and you have your quote and then your analysis, there's lots of different ways to do it. There's just some standard ways that I've given you. So it's not sort of a one size fits all thing. You can do it different ways. But yeah, it's a quote example. So. Just once an example. So once again, an example I used before, once again, just so you have this idea of the sandwich method. It's, let's say you're writing a paper on, well, what are you writing a paper? What are you writing a paper on? Just, I'm putting you on the spot.
Nothing right now.
Nothing right-
that requires quotations on sourcing.
Oh, really?
I'm writing a paper on my sister and her discourse community.
Oh, okay, great. So for that paper, are you integrating outside research?
Yeah, I interviewed her, so I'm using quotes from her. So did that count?
Okay, yeah. So in an
I
interview,
guess I wouldn't cite that, yeah.
well, I mean, if you're directly quoting from the interview, yeah. I mean, but for that, it would work the same way, where you're setting it up, where you're just like, whatever your sister's name is, as she mentions in this part of the interview. So that would be sort of your setup, and then you've got the quoted material, and then from there, you would sort of explain the relationship of the quoted material to your argument. So for an interview, it would work the same way. And I think, in Jordan, I think this answers your question, where it's a very formulaic process. It's just as long as you set it up in a way that it's clear, and then you integrate your quote, and then from there you have analysis that's clearly related to your argument or what your purposes of your paper are. I think that once again, there's so many different ways you can do it. And so from here, if you have, and if you're doing this at home, this would be really helpful, just sort of to make sure that you're employing this method. You can take out your work, if you have any with you, and just underline any quotes or paraphrases you're doing. And this is another good point when you're paraphrasing. So are you guys familiar with sort of paraphrasing? Yeah, I mean, so this is sort of an alternative to just straight up quoting. So often professors will say, I don't want you to quote that much, I want you to paraphrase. And so that's just putting the author's argument into your own words. But one thing about paraphrase is that even if you're paraphrasing, if you're getting their ideas, if you're still using an author's ideas, it's still pretty typical to in-text cite a paraphrase because you're still using their ideas. I had a professor one time, he told me, if you're paraphrasing, but you have to quote, if you have to in-text cite every sentence, you got to do it. I mean, it's just, even though you're not directly quoting, if your paraphrase is close enough to the writing that, someone could be like, it's getting a little close to the writing, you still, it's always sort of like a safety net to add that in-text quote, the in-text citation, even if you're paraphrasing. But then again, if you're doing just a general summary of like sort of the overview of someone's argument, that's not as necessary to sort of integrate like in-text citations. But if you're looking at specific passages and you're paraphrasing, that's different because that's when you're really looking at the language of their argument. That's when, even with paraphrasing, sometimes you really do need to do in-text citations. So so I'm just going to keep using your example because it's a good one. So for your interview, how have you been integrating the quotes or from it? If you just been sort of being like, and she says here.
Oh yeah, I'd just be like, according to Priscilla, and then I'd say a quote, and then I'd try to like do a sentence or two after describing. I mean, so yeah. Yeah,
and that's exactly all you need to do. So and if you're at home, is an interview considered a scholarly source? Yeah. Oh, this is a good question. This applies to this interview aspect as well. You can quote portions of a quote instead of setting it up like the sandwich method. So this is called sort of just integrating like I call it splicing in sort of sections of quotes. So with that, you can integrate parts of a quote into your sentence and sort of make it flow with the rest of your sentence. So an example of this would be like if you're saying like, I don't know, I'm stealing your last name again. So Matthews argues that, and then quotes, and then whatever part you're taking, and then actually since you're just taking sort of a section of it, you wouldn't like capitalize the first letter of the quote since you're just taking a section. So yeah, you can do partial quoting where you're just integrating parts and like that, where as long as it fits into the syntax of your sentence, then it makes, as long as it makes sense. So does that make sense where you don't always have to employ this, as the author argues, X, comma, you can sort of mesh it into your sentence as long as it's grammatically correct. Okay. Let me see, there's other questions. An interview can be considered I'll actually have to double check on that about an interview as being a scholarly source. I think it probably depends on if the interview was published in like a magazine or something, I think for the interview, it just sort of depends on where you're getting it. Depending on, it will determine sort of if it's considered a scholarly source. But I can double check on that for you. Yeah, because interviews can be tricky. Because like if you're just looking at some random interview on YouTube or something, and you're trying to use that as a source, that might be a little suspect. So it just depends, I think, on where you're finding in videos, for instance. So yeah, I think unless, do you guys have any other questions about this method or or specific examples? And anyone online, if you have any more questions, let me make sure that I got to everyone's questions so far. Can be considered a bias. I think okay. Someone's asking online if you're quoting, if you're using partial quoting and you're sort of taking their argument out of context and integrating it into your own. They're asking if that could be considered maybe sort of like a straw man argument, like you're only taking a part of their argument and applying it to yours sort of out of context. So that's where you have to make your own judgment call. Like if you're taking a piece of their argument and making it really fit to your own, I mean, that's something that you have to decide if, because once again, this is where your professor, if they wanted to, they could pull up the article and go to where you're quoting. And if they see, if the surrounding material is sort of contradicting what your argument is, they might question you on that. So even if you're quoting partially, you have to be careful to make sure that you're not taking it out of context to the point that you lose the author's original argument. So that's a very good question when you're integrating portions of quotes, because I mean, it really becomes an ethical issue in many ways, because if you're quoting from an author and you take it so much out of context and make it sort of a fit to your argument in a way that they lose sort of their context, then that can be a problem. Use several quotes from the same source. Someone else is asking online if you're using several quotes from the same source. Typically, I know in MLA, like if you're writing on one text, like let's say you're just writing on one book, after you cite it once, like the full in-text citation, after that it's okay to just use page numbers, I believe. But I think, yeah, I think depending on if you're just writing on one like work or one research document, I think after you do the first in-text citation is a full citation. From there, I think it's okay to sort of just use page numbers, because you don't have to say, like, for whatever reason, I'm just caught up on using this example. If you're writing on Moby Dick, for example, like you don't have to keep throughout the whole paper. You don't have to keep on saying Melville, 566 or whatever. Like, but if you're writing on multiple texts by him, then that's where there's also, in this, depending on your professor, you might have to integrate the title of the work to differentiate. So honestly, with in-text citing, clarity is really the most important thing, and not being redundant. So if there's no more questions from you guys, so the sandwich method makes sense, then just, yeah. I mean, it's really, and another thing that I would add is make sure that you're careful with block quotes, because a lot of professors really don't like them. So, because sometimes it is necessary to use a block quote, but you want to make sure that you use them very sparingly, because, I mean, a lot of students will just sort of use that as a way to like rack up their page count, and professors know that. So try to minimize block quoting when you can. But if it's necessary, like, and that's another thing, and this actually really works with the sandwich method as well. If you're using a block quote, then you have to be able to justify using every single piece of that block quote. And so you make a lot more work for yourself if you're block quoting. But once again, it is necessary, especially if you're doing a very very complex argument. A block quote may be necessary, but if you can, try to call it down to where you're not going to have to look at every piece of this. So that really just depends on how much of that information you really need. So yeah. Other than that, if you have no more questions, we're like right on time. We're at 12:30. And if you're watching at home, if you have any more questions, I'll look through and I'll get to you. But yeah, if you guys have any more questions or anything, you're free to hang out as I'm answering more questions. But that's pretty much everything. It's a very quick workshop. It's just looking at. Yeah, there's another workshop at 1. And what was that one on?
I remember this one.
Analysis.
Critical analysis, right? Yeah. So if you're watching at home, there's another one at 1 about analysis, and so it would be good to do that one as well. Sort of, as we didn't go too in depth in this one, looking at really how to incorporate analysis. So it would be helpful, I think, if you wanted to stick around for that one. So, okay. Well, thank you for coming, and thank you online for coming. And here, let me just make sure that I answered all your questions before. Can you summarize quotes?
Do you know Tara Kelly's?
Okay, yeah. So Jamie, yes, you can summarize quotes. It's referred to as paraphrasing. So anytime especially if you're working with a long quote, if you don't want to incorporate like a block quote, it is okay to summarize. But if you're paraphrasing, if you get really close to their exact language, you'll still need to do an in-text citation. But you're right, it is okay to summarize quotes. Yes, I will. Yes, I will post some. I found a really good article about the sandwich method. I will post that somewhere to make sure that anyone who's watching this can access it. Is the best way to So if you want to integrate a block quote, you just have to make sure that all of the information in the block quote is relevant to your argument. Like often when people use block quotes, there's a lot of stuff in there that might not be essential to the argument. So you can justify using it. In one way you can do a block quote is using ellipses. Like if you have points in there that the author you can omit, you can maybe sort of splice together different parts of it with ellipses. But you can justify using block quotes, but you just have to make sure that every piece of it is relevant, because many writers use them and they're important, but you just have to make sure that they're just not there and you're not just leaving it with no analysis. Elisa, the sandwich method, I mean, this is just a term they use for quoting, but I mean, it is sort of a good check for your own, the way you argue. So you could apply it to other types of argumentative context, like you always want to set up the context of your argument, and then you have your argument, and then you have your analysis. So that really the sandwich method is based on just how you would do any type of argument, where you have the context, then your sort of, I guess you call it evidence, and then your analysis. So, I mean, it could apply to other situations, but the quote unquote sandwich method is just, it's just a term they're using in that way. Use it statistics. Yeah, with statistics, I mean, if you're using statistics, you would do it any other way. Like if you're quoting from a source that's using statistics, you would set it up any other, like you would a normal quote, where you introduce it, and then you have the statistic, and then you have to explain why the statistic is relevant to your argument. So once again, so incorporating statistics would be an example of how you can sort of use this framework of the sandwich method to use to other contexts. Quoting, okay, quoting too much, even if you're in text citing something, professors often, like if you're like quoting like a whole page of something, that can definitely be a problem. But as far as copyright issues, because even if you're quoting huge sections or something, as long as you're attributing the source and the author, there's not really an issue with copyright. The issue is really going to be an issue with your professor saying, do you need like this whole page or all these sections from the poem to integrate with your argument? So really, it's not really an issue of copyright. It's just an issue of making sure that you're only integrating the most important things. Because I mean, a copyright issue would just be if you quoted all this stuff from a poem and then you didn't, cite the author or the source. So yeah, it's really just making sure that you're not using too much of it sort of arbitrarily. So yeah, if you guys have no more questions, then if you have more questions, you can always ask them in the analysis workshop, because I think that the analysis workshop, it's going to get into a lot of these issues where you're setting up an argument and then doing the analysis. So, yeah, if you have any more questions, you can ask them in the next workshop. But yeah, I got you guys all checked in. Yeah, so that shouldn't be a problem. So yeah, thank you guys for coming. And you can certainly stick around for the 1 o'clock. And if you have more questions about just general ways to implement quotes or in analysis, then I think that the next workshop will be very helpful for you. And of course, always come to the Writing Center if you have any general questions. So, all right, thanks for coming.